In today's video, I'm gonna tell you the best GPU according to your budget, and we're gonna start from $50 and go all the way up to $4,000. And let's start with the first budget tier, which is the absolute bare minimum, $50. And in this budget, you only really have one realistic choice, which is the RX 580, the 8GB version. This GPU is good enough to even play modern 2026 titles on low settings. So, if you have absolutely no money and you can buy only the cheapest possible GPU, the RX 580 is the best and only entry-level option that I can recommend. It's gonna give you decent performance on 1080p, and you're gonna be able to run 99% of games, and even the ones you can't run, you might be able to run on very low settings. So the RX 580 is the best entry-level GPU. And sadly, however, in my country, the price of the RX 580 bumped from $50 all the way to like $60, but even though it bumped from $50 to $60, it is still a great value for the money. Next budget tier we have is $115, and for this price the best choice is the GTX 1660 Ti and the GTX 1660 Super. They're both identical, there's not really much of a difference. This GPU is gonna run all games at 1080p on medium settings, with modern titles running around 60 FPS with FSR quality, and so this GPU is not really the best value to performance ratio, but it is the best choice if you only have $115 to spend on a GPU. The price may vary a little bit according to where you live, however it should be close to $115, around $125 max. Third budget tier, which is going to be $150, and for that amount of money the absolute best choice there is the RX 5700 XT. This GPU is a little bit old but still gold, and it has 8GB of VRAM, which is way more than enough for 1080p, and you can even go 2K with older titles like GTA V or other games, with modern titles being able to run on around 45 to 60 FPS according on the settings you set and also the FSR. However, with FSR quality and medium to high settings, you can run almost all games on 1080p or even 2K with no issues at all. So this GPU is going to guarantee you they're going to be able to run all games on 1080p with no issues. However, you can't run all games on 2K, that is going to require a better GPU. Which takes us to the next tier, which is $170. And for $170, the best GPU is the RTX 2060 Super or the RTX 2070. They're almost identical, they give the same performance, and these two GPUs aren't really that different from the RX 5700 XT. The only difference is that they have ray tracing and they also consume way less power, and those two GPUs are going to be able to run every single game that you could possibly think of. Even if it's a modern game like Pragmata or Doom the Dark Ages, you're going to be able to run them with no issues on 1080p. Sometimes you might be able to run those games on 2K, but it really depends on your personal preference, whether you prefer high FPS with low settings or if you prefer high settings with lower FPS. It's really up to you. But overall, the 2060 Super and the 2070 are going to give you decent performance on 1080p and sometimes 2K. Fifth budget tier that we have for today is $220, and for that amount of money you can get a very good GPU in my opinion, and a very goated GPU, which are the RX 6600 and the RTX 3060. Those two GPUs are gonna run every single game that you could think of on high FPS on 1080p or around 60 FPS on 2K. As I said, it really depends on what you prefer. However, the RTX 3060 and the RX 6600 are more than enough to guarantee you 5 years of running games with no issues at all. The sixth budget tier that we have for today is $300, and my personal favorite GPU for this budget is the RTX 3070. The only issue with the 3070 is that it only has 8GB of VRAM, which is kind of fucking stupid. However, there is an alternative, which is the RX 6700 XT, which is gonna give you almost identical performance, sometimes getting a little bit more than the RTX 3070, and it also has more VRAM. So, if you're a video editor, I recommend the 3070. If you don't edit at all and you don't need the NVIDIA encoders, I recommend you go with the 6700 XT, since it's more than enough for gaming, and you can run all games on 2K with no issues at all, and the settings are gonna vary depending on your preference. However, in most games, you're gonna be able to get more than 60 FPS safely with no issues. The 7th budget tier that we have for today is $350. And for that amount of money, my personal favorite GPU is the RX 6800. That GPU is an absolute monster. I ran all games on 4K with FSR quality in my previous video. However, on 4K, it only gave me around 45 to 60 FPS. So I would say this is a 2K high settings GPU, not a 4K GPU. On 2K, it is going to give you an absolute wonderful performance. And I absolutely love this GPU. The Nvidia alternative, which is maybe the RTX 3080, isn't really that good. So for this specific budget, I can't really recommend an Nvidia alternative. The 9th budget tier for today is $550, and for that budget, there is only one logical choice, which is going to be the RX 7900 GRE. This GPU comes with 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It is a monster for 2K. You can play whatever game you could possibly think of on 2K, high settings, high FPS. And the alternative from Nvidia is much more expensive, which is the RTX 4070 Super, which is very hard to find and also way more expensive even if you do find it. And that's why for $550, the only logical choice is the 7900 GRE. The next budget tier is gonna be $825. And for this budget, the absolute monster, one of the best GPUs to ever exist in my opinion, which is the RX 9070 XT. This GPU is gonna guarantee you 100% every single game is gonna run very smoothly on 2K on the highest possible settings. And you can even go 4K on the highest possible settings and get around 40 FPS on story mode games. However, the alternative from Nvidia is the RTX 4080, which again, I don't think is logical. It is much more expensive than the RX 9070 XT. However, if you can find it used, you can actually get it for the same price as the RX 9070 XT. Any GPU that is in between the 4080 or the 9070 XT and let's say the 5090, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense, because you either go crazy and play 4K high FPS and go with the 5090, or you just want a decent performance on 2K, and the 9070 XT is going to give you crazy good performance for 2K, so there is absolutely no need for any GPU in between those two tiers to ever exist. That is my personal opinion. So if you have money to burn, just get a 5090 and play on 4K, and that's it. Thank you for watching.